It was explained that the land had originally belonged to the wolves, whose nature was driven by an alluring yet insatiable desire. They longed to claim every plaything for themselves, believing that rulership required only one thing: the possession of power. The wolves had never imagined that those they had always regarded as nothing more than mere slaves, the weak foxes, would one day overturn the hierarchy of power. It was said that the first fox ever to wield power greater than the wolves was Arya. Arya was described as the woman who led all the foxes in overthrowing the wolves and then erased them, causing them to vanish without leaving a single trace. With the passage of time, the foxes were said to have grown into a powerful kingdom, one that was composed solely of women. It was later revealed that the Black Wolves' kingdom had suddenly emerged from nowhere, silently conquering half of the mainland. At the same time, there existed the Fire Fox Kingdom, a realm of only women. It was implied that this tale was, in truth, both his story and her story intertwined. One night, deep inside the jungle, it was reported that a unit of the army forces was stationed there. One of the senior captains was heard announcing that the Alpha team would handle the mission objectives. He instructed everyone to regroup within 10 minutes and informed them that they would have to move deep into the valleys, advising them to prepare all their necessary equipment. The captain further mentioned that although they were well equipped and the surrounding area appeared safe enough, they were not to let their guard down under any circumstances. He concluded by telling them that they had exactly 6 hours to complete the mission. The team responded in unison, acknowledging his orders by saying, "Yes, sir." Among the unit, it was noticed that 2 members of the force, both boys, quietly talking to each other as they prepared for whatever lay ahead. It was stated that one of the soldiers, Han Wol, spoke in a low but irritated tone, remarking that even for the Delta Force, being dispatched so deep into the jungle at such a late hour felt excessive. Han Rang responded calmly, acknowledging that Han Wol might be right, but he added that they had already enjoyed far too many peaceful days in this region. According to him, such calm never lasted, and it was only natural that things would eventually escalate. As they continued forward, it became clear that the captain walking ahead of them had been listening closely. Without slowing his pace, he spoke sharply, stating that he did not understand the reason he could hear their voices so clearly when their bodies were clearly not moving with enough urgency. He criticized them for letting their mouths work faster than their legs and gear. The captain then ordered them to stop talking at once and focus entirely on the mission objective. After a brief pause, his tone hardened as he added that their task was to drive their rockets straight into the Firefoxes without hesitation. In response, every member of the team raised their hand in acknowledgement and replied firmly, "Yes, sir." Following the command, the entire unit resumed movement in coordinated silence, advancing deeper into the jungle. As they descended further, one of the soldiers suddenly pointed something ahead, drawing the other's attention. Another remarked bitterly that without their interference, the people here would have starved to death long ago. Haerong then asked whether the DOQ unit was still responsible for overseeing the supply depot. He mentioned that he had heard the DOQ soldiers were among the toughest and most ruthless within the Delta Force. Hanwol said such a reputation should have been expected, reminding him that those units had already defeated the Foxes on several occasions. Haerong admitted that he did not fully understand the meaning behind Hanwol's last remark. Hanwol replied coolly that such confidence and dominance were privileges earned by the Delta Force. Once again, the captain noticed their exchange. He turned back briefly, his expression stern, and warned the soldiers at the rear to remain alert at all times. He reminded them that at their rank, they would not even be granted the opportunity to make contact, let alone make mistakes. As they finally reached their destination, one of the men commented with relief that they had arrived at last, though he immediately complained that his legs were aching severely from the long march. Another soldier quickly instructed them to search for guards in the area. At that moment, Haerong noticed something lying close beside him. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a dead body sprawled on the ground. Before the shock could fully settle, the captain issued a loud command, ordering everyone to prepare for battle immediately. The force members were visibly shaken, and one of them wondered whether the fire foxes were even in the area. Hanwol and Hanrong shouted almost simultaneously, declaring that there was no possible way this place could be their sacred territory. They demanded to know where the firefoxes were hiding. The captain reacted angrily, ordering everyone to drop their bags at once while cursing their lack of discipline. He then commanded them to ready themselves. In a swift motion, soldiers drew their swords, gripping the hilts tightly as tension filled the air. As they moved closer to the nearby houses, it became evident that numerous dead bodies were scattered across the area. The captain ordered the unit to thoroughly scout the surroundings. He instructed them to split into pairs and search every section of the area carefully. He also emphasized that they were to check for any survivors, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Haerong began inspecting the bodies one by one. After a moment, he stated that, just as he had suspected, all traces had been completely erased. Han Wol dismissed his words, calling them nonsense. Haerong clarified that he was referring specifically to the corpses, adding that he had heard stories of soldiers killing one another within the army itself, even among Delta Force units. Suddenly, Hanwol's demeanor changed. Filled with restless energy, he tightened his grip on his sword and moved toward the door of an old, unfamiliar building. He shouted, demanding that whoever was hiding inside stop hiding and come out immediately. Haerong was startled by his sudden boldness and remarked that Han Wol was braver than he had expected. Han Wol responded that it seemed they had already missed the firefoxes. They forced the door open and entered the building cautiously, checking every corner as they moved through the dark interior. Upstairs, they noticed a figure lying motionless, appearing to be unconscious. Han Wol warned Haerong to be careful, suggesting the person might belong to the Daokyu squad. Both of them struggled to make sense of everything that had happened in that place. Haerang then called Han Wol over, addressing him formally as Sergeant Major Han Wol. He insisted that calling for backup should be their priority. However, as they advanced further inside, they discovered even more dead bodies scattered throughout the structure. At that point, a barely conscious man spoke weakly to them. He urged them to flee the area as quickly as possible. With a faint, unsettling smirk, he warned them that the firefoxes were still close by. Hearing this, both Haerong and Han Wol raised their voices, urgently demanding to know where the firefoxes were hiding. Haerong stated quietly that he believed the firefoxes were somewhere nearby. In response, Han Wol insisted they advance immediately, telling Haerang it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He expressed strong confidence that if they managed to capture the foxes, promotion would be guaranteed. Han Wol further declared that their days of glory were no longer far off. As he spoke, a smile formed on his face, and he added that if death was inevitable, then it should at least be a glorious one. Haerong stepped forward and stopped him, urging him to wait for a moment. He warned Han Wol not to underestimate their enemies, reminding him that these were not ordinary foxes, but firefoxes. However, Han Wol ignored his concern entirely and continued forward, stating aggressively that they should seize the opportunity, destroy them, and kill them without hesitation. Haerong responded with frustration, pointing out that it was now only the two of them left. He remarked bitterly that the rest of their unit had already been taken down by the shameless foxes and their sneak attacks, adding that if it had not been for such tactics, the situation would have been different. Suddenly, Haerang experienced a vivid flashback. He remembered his father speaking to him in a serious tone, telling him to listen carefully. His father had warned that if he ever encountered the firefoxes, he must act in a particular way. He recalled his father demonstrating the actions to take when facing the firefoxes and giving him clear instructions to ensure survival. Pulled back into the present, Haerang and Han Wol began fighting the figures around them. Chaos erupted as they clashed with those present, striking and killing them one by one. During the struggle, Haerang swung his sword at one opponent, but a powerful counterattack followed immediately. The force of the blow sent him crashing to the ground. As he lay there, pain spreading through his body, Haerang began to think that perhaps a true firefox really was present. He then realized that the one who had attacked him was a woman. The impact left him disoriented, and as his consciousness began to fade, his thoughts drifted back to his father's guidance. In his weakened and nearly unconscious state, Haerong silently called out to his father, asking him to guide him through the situation, hoping that the lessons he had been taught would help him survive that lay ahead. He recalled the moment when his father had spoken to him with unusual seriousness, emphasizing that if he ever happened to encounter a firefox by chance, he must remember every instruction carefully. His father had told him to open his eyes wide, demonstrating the expression himself, and to part his lips just enough to show that fear had no hold over him. He had further instructed him never to forget to lift his chin upward by roughly 15 degrees, stressing that posture alone could determine survival. At the time, Haerong had listened, but could not understand the meaning of such odd, specific guidance. Sometime later, Haerang slowly regained consciousness. As his awareness returned, he realized he was seated in a chair, unable to move. His arms and body were tightly bound with ropes, restricting even the smallest motion. A black cloth covered his face, plunging him into darkness and heightening his confusion. Before he could fully process his situation, he heard a female voice close to him. The girl asked calmly whether he was awake, then told him she was about to remove the cloth from his face. When she finally lifted the cloth away, light flooded his vision. She immediately warned him to listen carefully, telling him that if he caused any kind of ruckus or reacted recklessly, the others would scold her for it. As she stood there, observing him closely, her gaze lingered, and she found herself unexpectedly impressed by his appearance, particularly the sharpness of his features despite his restraints. Haerong remained seated, silently meeting her gaze while carefully observing her in return. In his thoughts, he realized with disbelief that this was the first time he had ever seen a firefox. A moment later, another realization struck him even harder, that this was, in fact, the very first woman he had ever seen in his life. Alongside these thoughts, a strange sense of disorientation set in as he realized this was his first time witnessing what appeared to be cardio training. As he looked around more carefully, he noticed another pair nearby, a couple positioned beside them, moving in coordination as they performed the same cardio training together. The girl spoke again, telling him they had little time left. She explained that this was the first time they would be wrestling together and asked him to prepare. Her tone was firm but not unkind, as if this was simply a task that needed to be done. However, Haerong remained seated, his body stiff and his expression uncertain. He appeared deeply hesitant about taking part in the training. As his hesitation grew, his thoughts drifted inward once more. In his mind, he began seeking guidance again, reaching out to his father in his imagination, hoping for reassurance or direction. The weight of the situation made it difficult for him to stay present. In this flashback, he remembered a man calling his name, clearly and firmly, asking if he was awake. The man reminded him he was an only child and warned him solemnly that once he joined the army, he must never allow himself to be caught by the firefoxes. He spoke with certainty, saying that Haerong would be kidnapped within 2 days, and emphasized that he meant it in every possible sense. The man went on to say that it did not matter whether Haerong was simply a kind-hearted boy from a small village or someone who had been raised and trained as a soldier. According to him, the firefoxes would see through everything. No matter how much Haerong tried to hide his secrets, they would eventually pull every truth out of him. He had urged him to remember these words for the rest of his life. The man had also warned him never to indulge in fantasies about fox girls. He told him to face life as it came, naturally and without illusion, and never allowed desire or curiosity to weaken his resolve. That old man was his grandfather. Now, sitting there bound and powerless, Haerong reflected on those repeated warnings. He felt that his grandfather had tried again and again to prepare him for this exact fate, and he regretted not taking those words more seriously. He thought bitterly that he should never have allowed things to reach this point. As he returned to the present, he noticed the girl standing before him, her headlights shining. His eyes were drawn to her without intention, and in his thoughts, he found himself acknowledging how beautiful those melons are. The girl reacted calmly, tilting her head slightly as she asked him if that was true. Haerong found himself engulfed in a vivid memory of his grandfather's advice. He remembered the stern warning. If he even considered joining the girls in cardio training, he should abandon the idea immediately. Life, his grandfather had said, was meant to be lived fully, and any diversion from that was pointless. As these memories swept through him, Haerong became aware of the girl standing in front of him. She looked genuinely surprised as her eyes fell on the weapon. A mixture of caution and awe reflected in her expression. In another part of the forest, a man wearing a long coat moved deliberately through the dense trees. A sword hung at his side, catching the light in fleeting glimmers. He walked with careful, measured steps, observing every leaf, every shadow, and every subtle movement around him. His gaze was sharp and calculating, as if he were searching for something or someone, and his presence carried an unsettling air of suspicion. Elsewhere, 2 girls sat quietly, absorbed in their discussion about the upcoming cardio training. One of them spoke thoughtfully, analyzing the current contenders. She said this isn't bad, but it isn't strong enough to break records. Wolves these days aren't like the ones from the past. Finding a truly exceptional one has become so rare. She paused, turning to the blonde-haired girl beside her and asking her about her opinion of the 2 men who had just arrived. The blonde-haired girl smiled softly, her expression calm yet amused, which told her that one of them was the type we often see, and the other was more like a dog. The first girl's thoughts lingered on the comparison, which told her that the dog and the wolf are essentially the same. The blonde-haired girl laughed gently, saying it sounded different when she said it out loud. The first girl glanced at her companion, saying, "It's already been 10 minutes, she said, her tone tinged with impatience. The blonde-haired girl, however, suggested patience and asked her to give them a little more time. It won't be easy for wolves to find this place anyway. Even if it's Kareem's squad, it's been so long since we've seen any signs of them. Perhaps it's finally time they begin noticing Ara again." At that moment, a third girl appeared near the door, stretching and yawning. The first girl watched her and remarked lightly that she was yawning again. The blonde-haired girl instructed the third girl to focus solely on her cake. The first girl's thoughts drifted again, and she was saying that it's remarkable to think that that girl is the current incarnation of Arya. However, they have never seen the original Arya. The blonde-haired girl turned to the first girl and asked softly if everything was going well. Her voice carried a note of nostalgia. She said this reminded her of the old days. For some, this might be both their first and last experience, so they should enjoy it while it lasts. Meanwhile, Hairong and the girl faced each other, their eyes locking in tense silence. A wave of self-reproach swept over him, making him feel weak, faint-hearted, and nothing more than a subordinate in the world of wolves, creatures he now believed must be subdued and conquered. At last, the girl spoke, introducing herself clearly. Her name is Miro Danby. Hai Rong's gaze remained on her, yet his mind wandered back to his grandfather's words, remembering the warning never to forget the lessons imparted. He reflected bitterly that he had spent his entire life absorbing every word his grandfather had spoken, yet now, faced with this moment, he could not recall a single one. A new, unfamiliar scent filled the air. The smell of the girl standing before him. His eyes dropped to the ropes binding his hands, and frustration surged as he realized how they neutralized his strength. Despite this, he could not deny that the experience was unlike anything he had ever known. Finally, after a moment of reflection and determination, Haerong and Miro Donby began performing the workout session together. Another girl was performing a workout session alongside Han Wol, but she seemed completely dissatisfied with the training. Her expression revealed a mix of frustration and determination as she watched the others, clearly feeling that the exercises were not challenging enough. Observing Miro, Danby, and Haerang, she approached them and, turning to Miro, pointed out that Haerang had impressive cardio skills. She added that, if Miro allowed her, she could take over and manage him herself. Miro, his eyes narrowing in irritation, told her not to worry about him, emphasizing that he had already practiced and was fully capable. The girl, however, remained composed and slightly defiant, insisting that she had no intention of interfering. She explained that if Miro could not handle Hairang, she would willingly sacrifice herself for the task. Miro then turned to Hairang and instructed him to focus entirely on the training and on her. Hairang felt a surge of responsibility, realizing the importance of the moment, and told her he understood. She, in turn, said this was the most crucial moment of her life, a pivotal moment that could define her abilities. Hairong silently acknowledged that this was equally significant for him, understanding the weight of the training session in shaping both their futures. With this mutual understanding, both continued their rigorous workout session. Meanwhile, the girl who embodied Arya observed her surroundings with keen attention, her senses heightened. She noted an unusual scent in the air and remarked to herself that she could smell a wolf nearby, a presence that immediately set her on edge. At that precise moment, Ryu Karim, the king and leader of the Black Wolves, appeared, moving with a commanding presence as he confronted the incarnation of Arya. His gaze was intense, sharp, and unwavering, as if he were dissecting every detail of her being. Inside, the couple remained completely absorbed in their training, seemingly unaffected by the presence of such a formidable figure outside. Ryu Karim paused briefly before the door, and with a single, overwhelming display of strength, shattered it into countless fragments, clearing his path inside. The incarnation of Arya immediately attempted to counter him, launching an attack in a swift effort to halt his advance. Ryu Karim, however, moved with an almost effortless grace, evading her strike with precision that made the attack appear meaningless, as though it did not affect him whatsoever. She commented sharply, acknowledging that it had not taken him long to arrive, her tone laced with both caution and challenge. He responded coolly, explaining that the fox's scent had been powerful, guiding him directly to this spot. She retorted, pointing out that he still had a way of speaking that was harsh and crude, almost like garbage. Ryu Karim remained unbothered, his expression cold and unwavering, stating plainly that he did not care about any of the so-called third-class foxes. His focus was singular, his intention clear. Raising his sword and pointing it deliberately toward her neck, he demanded her collar, making it unmistakably clear that he expected her to demand that collar without hesitation. Haerong was asking Miro about all the ongoing conversations, trying to piece together the chaotic scene that was unfolding around them. Just then, quite suddenly, Hina appeared from behind, moving swiftly and determinedly. Without any hesitation, she began draping Miro with the large, heavy gowns, all the while urging her to hurry and not waste a single moment. Then, turning her attention to the blonde-haired girl, Hina's voice carried a firm urgency as she instructed her not to wait, to act immediately, and to make sure everyone kept the same pace. Hairang remained seated, quietly observing, his mind struggling to process the flurry of actions happening before him. He felt entirely out of his depth, binding himself in confusion as he tried to understand the motives and plans of everyone around him. Meanwhile, the incarnation of Arya, poised and calm, yet alert, was asking Ryukarim if it was truly acceptable to let all of them go. Ryukarim, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips, replied that she should stop asking questions and reassured her that not for a single second would he take his eyes off her. Observing his composure, she thought to herself with a subtle hint of approval that it was clear he understood his priorities very well. The blonde-haired girl's anxiety became evident as she called out to Hina, urging her to hurry and warning that the goons could arrive at any moment, adding another layer of tension to the scene. Hina acknowledged her warning with a brief nod, understanding the gravity of the situation. Then, with determined intent, Hina tried to stop Miro and Haerong from continuing their workout, asserting she would force them to stop immediately. Yet both Miro and Haerang showed no signs of yielding, appearing resolute and unwilling to interrupt their actions, which made Hina visibly concerned, her brow furrowing and her eyes reflecting a mixture of worry and urgency. Despite this, Hina managed to grab Miro, firmly yet carefully, and led her out of the room. This moment was witnessed by everyone present, including Haerong, whose eyes followed the scene with a mixture of disbelief and unease. Haerong's mind raced as he reflected on the chaos unfolding before him. He thought bitterly that he had completely failed to make sense of the situation, that he felt as though his sense of understanding had evaporated entirely. Yet, in that very moment, he realized with a grim awareness that, despite his confusion, he had somehow managed to make himself the most infamous person in the world. This recognition made him feel both humiliated and powerless. As Hairong's gaze settled on the girl standing directly in front of him, his mind struggled to comprehend her presence. He wondered whether she was truly the incarnation of Arya, the legendary warrior whose skill and cunning were whispered about, and the enigmatic, terrifying Fox. He realized with dawning clarity that her name was Ara Yunsul. In a sudden and shocking gesture, Ara removed the collar from her own neck and placed it carefully on Haerong's head. The act left him completely stunned, his mind unable to process the meaning or purpose of what he had just witnessed. Panic and shock overtook him. Amid this turmoil, he could not ignore the simmering anger etched clearly across Ryukarim's face, a sight that only amplified his sense of dread and helplessness. He appeared extremely frustrated, his body tense and his mind restless, as Haerong silently observed the situation unfolding around him. He reflected that even now, the fox and the black wolf continued to move within their own territories, coexisting in a way that felt strangely incomplete, as if some invisible thread between them had been left unresolved. Despite this sense of unease, the day was passing steadily, and he took in the island around him, shaped by the remnants of the fire giant's power. The volcanic forces that had once forged this land left behind not only its rugged terrain, but also its history, the story of how the island had become known as the women's country, rich with minerals and teeming with fish. Haerong thought about how people spoke of it as bright, lively, and remarkably clean, yet the true measure of its power lay in the foxes that roamed the northern lands, creatures of astonishing strength and cunning. To the south, the plains spread wide and fertile, their fields brimming with crops. The abundance of food naturally attracted countless rats and birds, and the atmosphere here was noticeably rough, plain, and far less pristine than the northern lands. Still, the people who lived there were powerful, shaped by the demands of their environment. Hairong considered the ruler of these southern lands a figure known as the Black Wolf, who now governed only the men's country. In contrast, Hairong's own home occupied a tiny, narrow strip of land, a place that stood between these two powerful territories, marking the delicate boundary of influence. Meanwhile, after regaining consciousness, he slowly opened his eyes to find himself lying beside a bed. His thoughts drifted immediately to his home, where he was already present, and he felt a lingering drowsiness, the result of a grueling interrogation that had lasted through the entire night. The police officers had pressed him to confess whether he had given them the protein shake, but he refused to lie, insisting on telling the full truth. Returning to the present, he realized with a shiver that if he had endured even one more round of questioning, he might never have been able to leave that place. His thoughts then turned to Miro Danby, the the girl with whom he had done the strenuous cardio. A wave of regret swept over him as he reflected on his own decisions, realizing how far he had strayed from the guidance his grandfather had once given him. He recalled her clear, lively voice, the faint but captivating scent she carried, and the energy that seemed to surround her. All of it had drawn him in and clouded his judgment. He knew with a sinking certainty that they would likely never meet again. In his mind, she was a mischievous, almost dangerous presence, a girl who had compelled him, against his will, to undergo the punishing cardio training. Suddenly, in the middle of everything, the door opened abruptly, and a giant man stepped into the room, his presence immediately drawing everyone's attention. Haerong's eyes widened in surprise as he recognized the man. It was his father. His father, with a calm but commanding gesture, signaled to him that it was time for supper. Haerong looked at his father, scrutinizing the expression on his face. He wondered silently whether the smile his father wore was sincere or merely a mask. The question lingered in his mind for a moment, but before he could voice it, his father spoke. He asked almost rhetorically whether his father really needed an explanation for every expression he made, implying that some things should simply be understood. Then, in a serious tone, he reminded Haerong that the entire country was in a panic over the situation surrounding him. Haerong, attempting to maintain his composure, replied that everything would calm down sooner than anyone might expect. He tried to sound confident. At that moment, another man who had been standing quietly in the house stepped forward. He spoke in a formal tone, apologizing for bringing troubling news, but making it clear that the situation was anything but something that could simply fade away. He said he had come without official authorization, underscoring the urgency and irregularity of his visit. The man addressed Haerong's father by his name, calling him Mook Bum, which momentarily caught Haerong's attention. Mook Bum responded politely, asking the man if he would like to join them for supper. The man, however, smiled faintly but declined, explaining that there was no time to waste on formalities and that he needed to get straight to the point. He introduced himself as Baek Mu, a member of the King's Direct Intelligence Bureau, specifically part of the Shadow OPS unit, a fact that carried weight and authority in itself. Baek Mu then turned his attention to Haerong, explaining that he was immediately being relieved of his duties as a private in the support unit. He made it clear that from this moment on, they would take full responsibility for Haerong's well-being, a statement that conveyed both protection and a loss of autonomy. He stressed that Haerong needed to grasp the gravity of the situation quickly. The weight of responsibility was immense, and he was now tasked with bearing the collar's burden. This object had far-reaching implications and had attracted the attention of every agency in the country. Even the king himself was monitoring the situation closely. Baek Mu explained that everything that had happened to the owner, presumably the person tied to the collar, was a direct consequence of it. He concluded by making it clear to Haerong that his duties would now be very precise, and asked whether he was paying full attention to the explanation. Haerong stood there, looking utterly shocked, his mind racing to process the sudden developments. Internally, he reflected that he had never anticipated such extraordinary events intruding upon his otherwise normal life. He realized that all of these complications had stemmed directly from the kidnapping incident, a series of events over which he had no control. Amid the chaos, a fleeting frustration crossed his mind. He had not even been able to perform his cardio training. Baek Mu told Haerong that the collar he had brought belonged to Ara Yunsul. He further stated that Haerong would soon begin to feel the true weight of that name resting directly upon him, whether he wanted to or not. After saying this, Baek Mu turned his back as if the conversation had ended, but then paused and looked back at Haerong once more. He said Haerong had no choice in the matter. He reminded him they would be leaving at the previously mentioned time, and added that from then on, they would encounter each other quite often, and those meetings would come suddenly and without warning. Haerong remained standing where he was, his expression completely blank and empty. For a moment, he seemed disconnected from reality, unable to react or respond. That distant state abruptly shattered when someone suddenly punched him in the face, snapping him back to awareness. Immediately, several boys surrounded him, raising their voices and shouting at him to hurry up and spill everything. They demanded that he explain every detail without leaving anything out. Another boy stepped forward and threatened him, warning that he was fully aware of whatever would happen if the story failed to be entertaining. The shouting grew louder as more boys joined in, yelling at him to hurry up, for God's sake. They claimed that the entire town was already getting excited and told him not to even think about chickening out. They insisted that everyone had already heard about the situation there. leaving him no room to escape. A large lunch table had been placed in the middle of the area, and all the boys gathered tightly around it. They continued shouting over one another, loudly suggesting that the same kind of thing had probably happened to Gilsang and Yunshi as well. Their voices overlapped, turning the place into complete disorder. Finally, one of the boys raised his voice above the rest and told everyone to quiet down, announcing firmly that Rong was about to speak. Rong began to explain that the rookies were trying to experience everything secondhand, attempting to imagine situations they could never realistically understand or perform. He described how, when he finally came back to his senses, he realized that his hands were tightly bound behind his back. He mentioned that his arms were already aching and exhausted from being held in that position for too long. He continued, saying that a short-haired girl fox stood before him. According to him, she was in the middle of removing his uniform when she calmly asked him to join her for cardio. He went on to explain that at first, he did not react to her actions or her words at all. He remained still and unresponsive, unsure of how to respond. However, she then asked him whether he needed any help from her. As she said this, she began showing him some headlights. Haerong explained that those chocolates reminded him of sweet honey. He said that after looking at them for a moment, he decided to agree to wrestle her. All of the boys were present there, sitting and listening to the story with intense dedication. Their expressions betrayed how deeply absorbed they were, none daring to interrupt. At one point, he remarked that they should hold themselves together because he had not even truly begun the story yet. Time passed without anyone noticing, and by the moment he finally reached the end of his narration, it had already grown late into the night. By then, all of the boys were lying scattered across the floor, their bodies slack and heavy, appearing half asleep, as though the weight of the story had drained the last of their strength. Seeing this, Haerong began calling out their names one by one, urging them to wake up, gather themselves, and go home to sleep properly. After making sure they were at least breathing steadily, Haerong walked toward the fridge and opened it, expecting to find something to drink. Instead, he was taken aback when he realized that all the beer in the house had already been finished, leaving the shelves empty. At that moment, his father, Mook Bum, came into the room and noticed Haerong standing there. He told him to leave everything as it was, calmly explaining that the boys would eventually wake up and find their way home. Hearing this, Haerong turned toward his father and asked whether he was finally done with his business. His father replied that he was almost finished and had more or less settled things with the bigger ones. He then advised Haerong to prepare himself and warned him not to be late for the departure, adding that the place he was about to go to would be vastly different from the life he had known back at the unit. As he listened, Haerong found his thoughts drifting toward the Special Forces headquarters known as Shadow OPS. It was an organization that directly commanded the Special Forces and only drafted the absolute best among them. Simply being selected was considered an extraordinary honor, symbolized by the collar they wore. His father told him he would soon understand everything for himself, but also explained that the Special Forces followed a strict policy regarding Taeok clapping. There was a quarterly quota that had to be met without exception, and failure to meet it would incur penalties. He further mentioned that there was a Taeok clapping license granted only to first-class warriors. At present, it is mostly used as a symbol of pride, but the long-standing, stable friction between countries has gradually left both sides bored. As time passed, they began to create formal rules, such as requiring strict adherence to the winner's wishes in such situations. His father continued explaining that the winners had the authority to demand Taeok clapping on the spot. They could decide the location and timing, and even specify certain postures during its performance. Of course, he clarified, such demands could only be made by those who had secured victory. After finishing his explanation, his father asked whether he was beginning to feel even a little motivated. Haerong replied that he felt motivated, but he also admitted that, no matter how hard they tried to appear strong, everyone knew they were the first to arrive. Because of that, others mocked them, calling them losers who could not even satisfy the foxes. As he said this, Haerong noticed a strange expression forming on his father's face, something subtle yet unusual, and he asked him about it. Instead of answering directly, his father countered with a question of his own. He asked Haerong how it had been for him personally, whether he himself had been called a loser, and whether the first fox had made fun of him. Haerong said he didn't think Danbi had treated him that way. At the sound of Danbi's name, his father was visibly surprised and immediately asked whether she had actually told him her name. Haerong confirmed that she had. His father then questioned whether he had shared this information with anyone else. Haerong replied that no one had even asked him about it. Upon hearing this, his father said that it was a good thing. He then explained that there was one important rule: the foxes should never break during workouts with the wolves, never reveal their names. He clarified that this was because wolves could track down a fox who was expecting a child once her identity became known. His father went on to say that Bed Fox had revealed her name to him and that such an act was against all established rules. As he listened, Haerong found himself unable to grasp the deeper meaning behind the conversation. With visible confusion, he asked his father to continue and explain further, hoping that the missing pieces would finally fall into place. However, his father replied that it would be better to end the discussion there. He observed that everyone present appeared bored and disinterested, and there was no reason to prolong the matter any further. Turning back toward Haerong, his father spoke once more, this time with a firm and unmistakable tone, reminding him that he was destined to become a king and instructing him never to forget that truth, no matter the circumstances. Haerong said that all these statements were coming without warning. He said he could not understand his father's words and confessed that it felt as though false hope were being offered to him without explanation. His voice carried uncertainty rather than defiance. In response, his father firmly stated that such words should never have been spoken to one's father, making it clear that the manner of speech itself had crossed a boundary. When the night finally passed, the next morning arrived quietly, and the first light of dawn spread across the sky. Haerong found himself seated in a moving carriage, bound for his destination. As the wheels rolled forward, his thoughts drifted inward. He reflected that by distancing himself from his home, he had also separated from a part of himself, a part he had once taken for granted without ever realizing its value. The thing that had once been a fortunate and private refuge now felt as though it was under fire, while his father seemed to be enjoying himself elsewhere, unaware of how that unseen fire was slowly draining the life and strength out of him. Sitting inside the carriage, Haerong lifted his gaze toward the sky and quietly observed the weather. He wondered how his father had managed to know so many top-level secrets within the intelligence network. The thought troubled him, as his father had never openly spoken about such matters. At the same time, Haerong realized that he himself had never truly asked. When the carriage finally reached its destination, the movement slowed to a stop. The carriage driver addressed Haerong and asked him to gather his belongings and prepare to step down. The carriage driver smiled warmly as he spoke, thanking Haerong and remarking that, although it might sound amusing, he had a strong feeling that Haerong would adjust very well to the place. He added that Haerong should call him whenever he was out on leave. Haerong stepped down from the carriage and replied that he would do so, respectfully telling the driver to take care. After leaving the carriage behind, Haerong stood outside a large house, positioned directly in front of its imposing gate. As he paused there, taking in the sight before him, he quietly acknowledged to himself that he had finally arrived. The weight of the moment settled in, making the place feel both unfamiliar and inevitable. Suddenly, an officer's voice called out his name from behind. Startled, Haerong turned around immediately, straightened his posture, and saluted her, responding formally. The female officer remarked that he had arrived 21 minutes early and praised him for his good work. She then asked him to follow her, saying that she would show him the way. As they walked, she introduced herself as First Lieutenant Magi from the administration department. She greeted him and said she would take care of him for the time being. Her tone was professional yet composed, making it clear that she was accustomed to this role. She went on to say he had arrived at the perfect moment to witness the recruits' training. She suggested it might even be his lucky day, then asked if he wanted to take a look. Haerong responded affirmatively, indicating his interest. In response, she told him to observe closely, explaining that in about a month, this same training would be his own reality. Soon after, a gate opened in front of him, revealing a corridor that stretched ahead. From within that area, the sounds of unusual conversations and strained voices echoed outward, creating an unfamiliar atmosphere. As he stepped inside, he found a workout session already in progress. Watching the intense movements and disciplined coordination, Haerong realized that this was the world of the Special Forces, a world he was about to become a part of. Lieutenant Magi asked Haerong to take a closer look at the situation before him, explaining that this was exactly how things would look for him in about a month. Once the wrestling match ended, a man announced that the first test was officially over and instructed everyone to tidy the area and clean themselves properly. After making the announcement, the man turned toward Officer Magi and said, it was rather rude to enter right in the middle of an ongoing test. Magi responded that it wasn't as if this were her first time doing something like this, and casually asked whether there was anything truly worth paying attention to. The man replied that, as she could clearly see for herself, most of the participants seemed quite average. He added that since they were all recruits, there was nothing more to do but observe them over time and see how they developed. Throughout their exchange, Haerong remained standing nearby, quietly listening to every word of their conversation while carefully watching everything that was happening around him. As his attention shifted to his surroundings, Haerong glanced at the women present and found himself thinking they might be the dolls his father had created. Shortly after, the man asked about Haerong's identity, clearly wanting to know who he was. Magai said the boy was only there for a tour. In response, Haerong raised his hand and saluted the man respectfully. Magi then addressed the man as the instructor and said he had probably already heard the rumors about the boy, adding that his name was Haerong. She went on to say that this was the same boy who had become well known throughout the entire country. The men present were visibly shocked upon realizing he was the one who had brought back the Arayunsol collar. The instructor studied him closely, thinking to himself that the so-called pathetic excuse for a wolf might actually be Haerong. At the same time, Haerang stood silently, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar emotions rising within him, wondering whether everyone around him was deliberately trying to show him his place in the pecking order. Magi then said it was time to move on, noting it was nearly time to head back down. She also added that it was not every day that a newcomer like him got the opportunity to meet the bailiff in person. After saying this, the two of them left the area and began walking toward another section. As they walked, Magi reminded him to behave in the most respectful manner possible. Haerong replied that he was already accustomed to dealing with elders. Magi remarked that his behavior made him seem slightly suspicious, but she added that this was not necessarily a bad thing. Soon they arrived in front of a large door. Magi stepped forward and knocked, announcing that it was the personnel officer. A voice from within called to them, inviting them in. Magi then told Haerong to leave his bags outside. He agreed, and she informed him that she would see him later before stepping inside. Once he went in, he saw an officer seated behind the main desk. The officer called him forward and said he did not understand why Haerang was standing there, waiting around unnecessarily, addressing him as Private Haerang from the 572nd Support Unit. The officer continued to look at him with visible dissatisfaction and remarked that he was nothing more than a 3-month-old newbie recruit who was certain to give her an unbearable headache. He openly stated that she could not understand the reason Arayunsul had entrusted her collar to someone like him. Addressing Haerong directly, he explained that the Special Forces' fundamental purpose was to combine the best seeds with the finest seed bearers, ensuring strength and continuity. However, she added that, despite understanding the principle, she still failed to grasp why Arayunsul would think of creating such disorder and confusion through this particular decision. The officer went on to say that the finest warrior among the Black Wolves was undoubtedly Ryu Kurum. He bluntly admitted she could not understand why Arayunsul had chosen to completely ignore him. Instead, she questioned the reason someone as inexperienced as Haerang had been selected. Continuing her explanation, the officer said there was a place called Pushil. He explained that even though they were savage warriors, they could not hold workouts on the open plains like wild animals. Pushil, he clarified, was a luxurious establishment situated within a secretly neutralized territory. He further explained that Pushil contained more than 50 rooms, each crafted from the finest materials on the planet. According to him, every single room possessed its own unique interior, design, and atmosphere. He then added an important condition. If a man and a woman entered one of those rooms, they had to remain there for more than half a day. After stating the rule, the officer asked Haerong whether he understood everything the officer had explained so far. He then clarified her words, explaining that this condition meant the golden ticket to enter one of those rooms was exactly what he had received from Arayunsul. To reinforce his statement, the officer raised Arayunsul's collar and showed it to him, explaining that it meant he and Arayunsul were required to stay together in Pushil for that specific period. This revelation left Haerong completely shocked. His mind began to drift, and he found himself unintentionally imagining her, lost in thoughts that overwhelmed his focus. Noticing his reaction, the officer asked whether he truly understood everything he had said. He then said that things would become interesting from that moment on. He informed him that he had 1 month and that whoever received this collar was required to notify the date on which they would meet the foxes. He emphasized once again that all of these rights and privileges were granted only to members of the special forces. The officer asked whether he truly understood the implications, clarifying that it meant he had to prove himself capable of joining the special forces. He described this as an opportunity to assess how feeble a man he actually was. Meanwhile, Haerong remained deeply lost in his own thoughts. The officer continued speaking, stating that he was the only hope they had placed their expectations on. He then asked him directly whether he was Mukbum's son. However, Haerong did not respond, still consumed by his thoughts. Growing impatient, the officer asked him sharply whether he was even listening. The next morning arrived bright and clear over the borderland city within the Crimson Fox territory. Inside the force's lodge, Byolji, a member of the Thousand Steps Special Forces, was present and deeply engaged in a workout session alongside Mirtina. As they trained, their conversation turned to who might have received Ara Yunsul's collar. Byolji told Mirtina that Ara Yunsul had most likely been under interrogation for the entire day. She then admitted she could not understand Ara Yunsul's thoughts or the reasoning behind the decision. Ara was walking through the grand corridors of the castle as she made her way upstairs. As she approached a particular door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar, which immediately caught her attention and filled her with surprise. Curiosity compelled her to pause for a moment, and from her position, she could hear the conversation of several girls inside the room. It was Hina Pine who spoke with conviction, telling the others her words were valid and that she meant them. Her tone carried an urgency that made the matter seem more significant. One of the other girls, intrigued and doubtful, asked her if she was truly talking about that child, Miro Donby. Hina did not hesitate. She confirmed it was indeed Miro and explained that the child had been refusing to eat or drink anything, which was deeply concerning. Hina Pinay, a member of the Special Forces, elaborated, explaining that the situation was far more serious than it appeared at first glance. She suggested that Miro's behavior was a form of love sickness, the cause of her current state and strange conduct. Another girl, Hira Pinae, admitted she understood the gravity of the situation and added that if things worsened, Miro might face punishment for being deemed a defector. Hina acknowledged the possibility, but expressed her confusion, saying that while she knew the seriousness of the situation, she still did not understand whether the child was truly worth all the trouble unfolding. Standing nearby, Choa spoke up, stating confidently that all of these events were connected to Haerang. Hina responded with her own observations, explaining that the only thing she had witnessed was Haerang tied up and unconscious. She described his appearance, noting that he looked every bit like a puppy, with a decent height and presence, yet she emphasized that the most critical detail was the large weapon he carried. According to Hina, this weapon was the key piece of evidence, the only thing that made sense of the situation, and the very reason Ara Yun-sol had entrusted her with the collar. She added that even Danby's current state proved the weapon was worthy of a prince, underscoring the gravity of the matter. Suddenly, the group realized Ara was standing nearby, quietly observing them. They immediately mocked her, questioning why she had not reported to them as she should have. They reminded her that she had been in the interrogation room all night and asked why she was not in the biology room, as she was supposed to be, but instead was just standing there, seemingly idle. Ara responded calmly, saying she seemed busy with her own matters. Hina, skeptical and curious, pressed further, asking if she was swamped and expressing her inability to understand that Biol might be occupied at that moment. As the conversation continued, all of the girls began peeking into the biology room. Their eyes widened in shock and disbelief as they took in the scene before them. To their astonishment, they saw Ara fully engaged in a wrestling battle inside the room. On the other side, in the vast room, Lieutenant Magi stood with a poised, commanding presence, a stick in her hand and a poster prominently displayed beside her. The atmosphere was filled with a quiet tension, a mixture of anticipation and scrutiny, as she prepared to instruct Herr Hairong on the rigorous cardio training. Hairong remained standing there, his posture alert yet slightly tense, absorbing the scene around him. He noticed a man scrutinizing his weapon, studying its size and shape. After a moment, the man nodded in approval, acknowledging that the weapon indeed belonged to him. He spoke with a tone of measured admiration, expressing that, from his perspective, this was unmistakably the prince's weapon, an infrequent and exceptional phenomenon. His words carried a weight of awe, and he emphasized that the weapon was the largest of its kind ever recorded, leaving a subtle echo of amazement lingering in the room. The officer standing nearby shifted his attention and asked, his voice carrying a professional curiosity about the results of Haerong's physical examination. Mage, maintaining her composed demeanor, held up the report and recited the details with precision. She noted that Haerong had completed 30 laps of cardio in 42 minutes, an impressive feat demonstrating stamina and endurance. The obstacle course had been cleared in 11 minutes, a testament to his agility and speed. Furthermore, his muscle strength, vision acuity, auditory perception, and reaction time had been carefully recorded, culminating in a final assessment placing him in the middle class of rank 1. A ranking table sat nearby, methodically listing the results for reference. The officer's eyes widened slightly in surprise, reflecting a moment of genuine astonishment at Haerang's middle-class placement within rank 1, a recognition of his considerable capabilities, yet tempered by the strict hierarchy of the system. Baekmu, present in the meeting and exuding a calm authority, raised his hand to speak. He reminded everyone that 2 crucial spots still remained unfilled, his tone firm yet measured. Another individual rose immediately, emphasizing that the Black Comas also needed a recruit, and arguing that, under the merit system, it was only fair for Haerong to hold the position. Baekmu's colleague, however, dismissed this reasoning as nonsensical, pointing out that a recruit had been taken on not long ago and reminding everyone that the team had recently lost a team leader, a loss still felt keenly. Baekmu's voice resonated through the room, calm but edged with subtle irritation, as he expressed his inability to comprehend the fuss being made. He suggested that if others wished to make such a spectacle, they might as well bear the burden visibly and act embarrassed for their own pride. Then, shifting his focus, he addressed the matter of truth that everyone already knew the situation that had happened. Yet, some seemed to have temporarily forgotten who had targeted Haerang, Ara Yunsol of the Thousand Steps, a figure whose name alone carried weight and respect. Turning to Haerang, Baekmu asked in a voice that combined curiosity with genuine concern whether he felt capable of managing the responsibilities now resting upon him. Haerong stood frozen, the words caught in his throat, confusion clouding his thoughts. His mind raced, yet no clear answer emerged, and silence stretched in the room, heavy with expectation. Baekmu observed this quiet hesitation and remarked that it was perhaps inevitable that everyone had become too absorbed in the significance of the prince's weapon, allowing the larger context to fade momentarily from focus. The officer, his expression serious yet tinged with curiosity, noted that, all things considered, the situation was somewhat surprising. He explained that the remaining priority was to address the most critical element of all, that is, Haerong's basic power level. Baekmu added that, by coincidence, a volunteer teaching assistant was presently waiting to observe him, prepared to supervise and guide the assessment process. The man confirmed with resolute certainty that he would indeed be overseeing everything, leaving no aspect unattended. Haerang continued to stand in the center of the room, his body tense. A slow, inward realization settled over him that the day felt unusually long. After a while, once Haerang was finally free from the long, intense meeting, he stepped outside into the open air. His eyes quickly fell upon 2 men engaged in training, Leth moving with disciplined energy yet bearing the strain in their own ways. One of them complained that the training seemed to grow progressively harder and that his waist was screaming at him from the effort. The other man chuckled in agreement, pointing out that it wasn't as if they were marching into war, yet the physical strain made the complaint understandable. The first man then added that he had noticed a turn of shadow ghosts around today, and as his gaze landed on one of the men, he identified him aloud as Ryu Kurim. Haerong, unnoticed, stood silently behind Ryu Kurim, observing him. Ryu Kurim, catching sight of Haerong's presence, suddenly spoke, his tone sharp and edged with irritation. He remarked that Haerang's idiotic expression had been burned into his mind ever since that day, and he wished he could just strike him down right then and there. He warned that Haerang would probably be eaten alive by the Red Fox regardless. Pointing his sword toward Haerang with a forceful motion, he asked whether Haerang had ever swung a sword before, adding that he didn't care which weapon he chose. He was to show that he was truly made of. The words resonated deeply in Haerang's mind, stirring vivid memories of his childhood. He recalled training with his father, who had instructed him to attack freely, without hesitation. Yet when his father made a sudden move toward him, Haerang cried out, protesting that he should have been warned before being hit. His father had remained stern, telling him that it did not matter if he acted like a crybaby, he just needed to attack again, to keep trying. Hairong remembered shouting back, insisting that he should not have been called a crybaby. Those memories swirled through his head now, mingling with the sharp focus of the present moment. Returning to reality, Hairong gripped the training sword firmly in his hand, deciding that this would be his weapon. He declared quietly, to himself yet with conviction, that he preferred the training sword above all others. Ryukurim's expression shifted, frustration flickering across his features as he snapped that he had not asked about which weapon Hairong intended to use. From the windows of the castle, several men were observing the scene, their attention riveted. They noted the stark contrast between Ryukurim, who appeared infuriated, and Hairong, whose calm and stubborn demeanor came off as oddly amusing. Among the spectators, Ha Wung, a member of the detachment force, and Garimbi noted with some surprise that it was the first time he had ever seen the captain so visibly angry. Surimaru, another member of the detachment, remarked that the scene was looking increasingly dangerous and that at this rate, they might end up witnessing bloodshed. Bao Eden, also part of the detachment, observed the interaction with a hint of amusement, noting that even the shadow ghosts seemed excited by the display. Baekmu, calmly watching the unfolding training, muttered to himself in disbelief, questioning the reason Ryukarim seemed so intent on provoking Hairong so intensely. Another onlooker commented that it seemed overly harsh for a newcomer to endure such pressure. Amid the tension, Baekmu offered a handful of popcorn to the officer, suggesting that he try some, insisting that it was very delicious. The officer glared at him in response, clearly unimpressed, yet Baekmu continued cheerfully, insisting again on the taste. Meanwhile, at the Black Wolves' King Castle, the atmosphere was completely different, yet equally disciplined. Buksa Baram, the 57th monarch of the Black Wolves, was engaged in a rigorous workout session alongside a girl, his focus unwavering. Yet, even as he trained, his thoughts wandered. He considered Mukbum's son, the young man who possessed the prince's weapon, and contemplated Ara Yun's, recognizing that he might well become the best among all the foxes capable of mastering the intense cardio training. After completing the exhausting workout sessions with numerous girls, Bukse paused, scanning the room with a critical, discerning eye. He noted how most of the girls were visibly drained, their bodies trembling with fear. As he continued to observe, his gaze fell upon a girl sitting quietly in the corner. A sense of curiosity mixed with a faint twinge of concern stirred within him. He silently acknowledged that she was the only one left, and for the first time he truly focused on her training session. He approached her and asked if she was afraid of the training. He reflected that in his world, even slaves would obey without question, yet he sensed in her a spark of resistance or uncertainty. He warned her inwardly, with harshness and with firm authority, that she could not evade the training, that she must follow his guidance, and that he would take full responsibility for the process. Then, resolutely, he concluded the preliminary instructions, noting that today's session would end with her active participation. Without hesitation, he engaged her in a wrestling battle. When the day's grueling training finally came to an end, Buxa stepped out into the long, echoing corridor. His assistant was already waiting, standing rigidly as though anticipating his evaluation. The assistant inquired about the level of satisfaction he derived from the day's work. Buxe exhaled heavily, a trace of weariness in his tone, admitting that he was growing tired of repeating the same assessments. The results, he noted, were consistent with prior sessions. The assistant listened carefully before responding, acknowledging the routine nature of the training outcomes. Yet, he introduced a point that immediately captured Buxe's attention, that while acquiring large quantities of the standard product posed no challenge, achieving results of the highest concentration required a top-class product. Buxe's brow furrowed slightly in surprise, intrigued by the mention of something rare and exceptional. The assistant elaborated, recounting how 6 months ago, Ryu Karim had collected the last known top-class product, the blue columbine. It was said to surpass even the famed blue light variant, its quality and receptivity making it extraordinary. The small amount they had managed to extract thus far was barely enough to fill a modest bottle, yet its potency was staggering, estimated to be 10 times stronger than ordinary extractions. Buxe visualized the effect vividly of a single dose capable of elevating an individual's senses to extreme, almost intoxicating levels. The assistant explained that during workout sessions with the girls, this product would cause intense excitement, amplifying their reactions beyond normal limits. Buxe felt a surge of anticipation at the thought. His mind raced with possibilities as he imagined using the flower to influence the girls' responses. There was one particular girl who immediately came to mind, and he found himself eager to test the effect on her. However, he suppressed his curiosity for a moment and instructed the assistant to devote all his efforts to producing the substance, emphasizing secrecy. Not a single rival could suspect their work. He insisted it must remain entirely hidden. The assistant assured him that accomplishing the task would not take long. Buxé reflected internally on his own impatience. He admitted to himself that he had little tolerance for delay and felt a pressing urgency to correct the errors of his ancestors. His ambition to refine the detachment force boys to mold them into stronger, sharper warriors was relentless, and he knew that time was of the essence. Meanwhile, in a separate arena of tension and conflict, Rong and Ryu Karim were locked in a fierce duel. Every movement between them carried immense speed and precision, each strike resonating with controlled force. Rang launched a swift, calculated attack, which Ryu Karim expertly blocked, his muscles coiled and responsive. Rang laughed quietly, a mixture of admiration and challenge in his tone, acknowledging Ryu Karim's skill while teasing him subtly, saying that he had managed to block that, as expected from the strongest blade in the detachment force. Ryu Karim, however, could not conceal his growing anger. Each remark, each subtle acknowledgement of his strength from Hairong seemed to ignite a deeper fury within him. During the fight, Hairong found himself thinking that the real confrontation was only beginning at that very moment. In his mind, he felt that everything up until now had merely been a prelude, and that the true test of strength had finally started. Almost immediately after this realization, a massive clash of swords erupted between Hairong and Ryu Karim, the impact ringing sharply through the air. The sound alone was enough to spike the tension in the surroundings. The audience there was utterly surprised by the sight before them. Many of them had not expected Hairang to withstand such an exchange. Suri, watching closely, remarked that Hairang had timed his movement precisely so that he could block the incoming attack, and he pointed out that the captain had certainly not been holding back his strength. Ha Wung, who was standing nearby, added that what they had just witnessed was not something that could be dismissed as a simple block. Bao Eden, observing, noted that it actually looked as though the captain's sword had been pushed back slightly, even if only by a small margin. Rong then launched another attack toward Ryu Karim, putting everything he had into the strike. At the same time, he was thinking that he was completely screwed and that the situation was growing increasingly dangerous. Without hesitating for even a second, Ryu Karim responded immediately, delivering an attack of his own. One of the officers who had been closely watching the fight commented that Hairang was the real deal. He pointed out that Hairang was accurately pinpointing the exact position where the end of Ryu Karim's sword would be, and responding with precision, which made it seem as though he had truly gotten the captain's measure. That same officer then accused Mukbum of having hidden someone so valuable from them, likening Hairang to a diamond kept out of sight. Another man turned toward the officer, clearly surprised, and asked him to repeat his words, as if he wanted to be certain of that had just been said. Baekmu then joined the conversation, stating that he had anticipated something like this on some level. However, he admitted he had not expected Mukbum Sunbae to raise someone in such an unorthodox manner. Even so, Baekmu acknowledged that Hairang had gone far beyond anyone's expectations. He added that Karim was likely becoming increasingly frustrated and suggested that Hairang intervene before he went too far. Suddenly, Baekmu entered the ground himself and shouted that it was enough, declaring that the test would end there. He pointed out that Karim's violent temper seemed to be surfacing and suggested they stop there. He remarked that the world had not been delightful these days, and now that someone interesting had finally appeared, there was no reason to ruin it. Baekmu directed these words toward Karim before announcing that, from that moment onward, the common soldier Hairang had erased the Shadow Ghost's doubts and proven his capability by successfully passing all of the detachment tests. Baekmu then asked the entire council whether they agreed with this decision. The whole council responded in unison, agreeing. After that, Baekmu asked whether they consented to recruiting Hairang into the Garimbi. Once again, they all answered yes. Baekmu turned to Hairang and asked whether he had given his consent as well. Hairang replied respectfully that he did. Afterwards, several members laughed, looking at Hairang and commenting that he was a truly amusing person who had appeared out of nowhere. Another member remarked that he was Mukbum's son and noted that the foxes would surely grow restless, eager to get their hands on Hairang. It was also said that from that point onward, Hairang would have to experience everything starting from the very bottom. Since they had all gathered like this, they suggested they drink together and asked Baekmu whether he would be treating them. Baekmu replied without hesitation that he would. Meanwhile, Hairang and Ryu Karim stood facing each other in silence, staring directly into one another's eyes. Hairang thought to himself that these men truly were the strongest warriors of the Garimbi detachment force. He realized that he had taken them too lightly, but he also firmly believed that the strongest blade within the Black Wolves would never unfairly order them to single him out. Later that night, deep within the jungle, rain poured steadily from the sky, soaking the surroundings in darkness and cold. Haerong sat alone in the middle of the forest, holding his sword tightly in his hand. As he reflected on the situation, he concluded that no matter how he looked at it, he truly had been singled out. He thought about how this was his very first field mission, how he had gotten lost, how he had ended up running into a firefox. The firefox, not recognizing him at first, looked at him carefully and asked whether he was the one who carried the prince's weapon. She then told him it was a pleasure to meet him. 2 hours earlier, Haerang had been seated inside a moving carriage along with all the other members of the detachment. He remained quiet, observing the atmosphere and the people around him. One of the men present was Suri Maru, a fighter known for swift, precise striking, relying on speed and sharp timing rather than brute force. Another member was Bao Eden, a man who openly took pride in his iron wall defense, carrying himself with the steady confidence of someone who trusted his ability to withstand any attack. There was also Ha Wung, the Amazonian warrior, whose incredible physical strength was immediately evident, and whose presence alone carried a sense of raw power. Sitting among them was the captain of the Garimbi detachment force, Ryu Karim, a man universally acknowledged as the strongest blade within the Black Wolves. As the carriage continued its journey, another member spoke up from his seat, remarking that if they included the member currently on a mission, their group would be complete at 6. He said it made the moment feel strangely fulfilling, as if it were worth celebrating. His words caused a sudden silence to settle inside the carriage, filling the space between all of them. After a brief pause, he spoke again, stating that he would repeat this once more, that all members of the detachment force were considered to be of equal class. He emphasized that they ranked members only by skill and accomplishment. In other words, how one performed and how far one advanced depended entirely on personal ability and effort. He then explained that the Garimbi team house, which fell under their jurisdiction, was conveniently located in the northeastern section of the border, approximately 40 miles from their current position. He added that they could easily make their way there without drawing attention or creating unnecessary trouble. However, he concluded that proceeding in such a simple, uneventful manner felt far too boring. At that moment, Surimaru suddenly decided to do something strange, seemingly just to break the dullness in the air. Without warning, he lifted his leg and aimed a kick toward Haerong, commenting that, as expected, Haerong did not seem to be a fake and suggesting that they try one more time. Haerong reacted quickly and blocked the attack, though he was clearly confused and unable to understand the reason behind Suri's behavior fully. Almost instinctively, Haerong struck back at Suri with his own leg, acting out of reflex and a sense of retaliation. The counterattack landed with unexpected force, strong enough to knock Suri's glasses off and send them flying far away. This immediately frustrated Suri, who visibly flinched at the blow. Haerong looked at him and asked whether this was some kind of hazing, trying to make sense of the situation. However, before he could grasp the situation any further, Haerong suddenly found himself outside the carriage, standing on the road. Suri, now standing there and holding his glasses, remarked that Haerong was a very amusing individual. He added that, just as the old man had said, Haerong truly was not normal. After saying this, Suri threw Haerong's sword, his map, and all of his other belongings out of the carriage toward him. He shouted that Haerong's hazing process officially began at that very moment. He told him they would see him again at the team house and added they would at least give him a warm welcome if he made it back alive. Finally, Suri wished him the best of luck, mockingly calling him the friend of the one who carried the prince's weapon. Haerong finished his thoughts, reflecting that he had never expected a warm or loving welcome from the beginning. Even so, he admitted to himself that he had never imagined such strange and unpredictable behavior from those people. However, he reassured himself that despite everything, he was at least confident in one thing, his ability to read a map. Believing this skill would guide him forward, he reached for the map, unfolded it carefully, and began studying it with focused attention. As he stood there reading, the atmosphere gradually shifted and rain began to fall, soaking the surroundings and marking the passage of time. Returning to the present moment, Haerong was now seated beside the artery, his posture steady but his thoughts heavy. He reminded himself firmly of who he was, thinking that his name was Haerong Ai, not Prince Weapon. The Firefox now stood directly in front of him, her presence unmistakable. She spoke confidently, telling him that she felt fortunate to have him standing before her. She reassured him there was no cause for concern, explaining she had no intention of bringing her colleagues here. She added that she could not imagine sharing him with anyone else. Introducing herself, she stated that she was a member of the detachment force known as the Pebbles of the Red Foxes and that her name was Hyangri Young Aji. She then asked him to remember her name clearly. As Haerong looked at her, he found himself thinking that it seemed common for detachment forces to exchange names in this manner, almost as a form of acknowledgement. At the same time, she continued observing him, carefully studying his posture, stance, and overall form. She wondered whether he was training with his sword, yet she could not understand the reason he would be wandering alone in such an area. She considered the possibility that he might be bait, but even so, she decided that this was prey she would gladly pursue. No matter that much danger he might carry within him, she resolved that she would devour him completely and then escape. With her decision made, she suddenly rushed forward to attack him. Haerong, already prepared, moved to meet her assault head-on. During her first strike, she realized to her surprise that he was not retreating but pushing directly into the attack. He disrupted her balance by placing his foot deliberately in her path, turning his shoes into an obstacle she had not anticipated. The sudden interference threw her off balance, and she fell to the ground. Haerong looked down at her and remarked that this outcome had likely occurred only because she had let her guard down, though he acknowledged that he had taken advantage of that opening. She looked up at him with a calm smile and asked whether he truly believed she would accept defeat so easily, insisting that she was still capable of fighting. Haerong met her gaze and calmly asked her to hand over the collar. She replied that she could give it to him. When he asked her once more, reinforcing his request, she finally conceded, admitting her defeat. Haerong held the collar firmly in his hand, turning it over slightly as his mind wandered. He realized this was technically his second collar. Yet unlike the first, it had been earned entirely through his own effort and determination. A small sense of pride and satisfaction stirred in him as he contemplated it. Breaking his reverie, he asked Hyangri whether it was truly necessary to do the cardio session right then, especially with the rain dampening the surroundings. Hyangri responded thoughtfully, noting that the rain might make things difficult, and suggested they meet later at the Pusil, where conditions would be better. Haerong's curiosity shifted to the question of who had charged at him earlier, as if Hyangri had insisted on training with him first. He voiced this aloud, trying to make sense of the sudden intensity of her approach. Then, with a more relaxed tone, he reassured her that there was no need to worry about anything, that he would ensure that everything turned out fine, and that no harm would come from the training. With that mutual understanding, they began their workout together, the rhythm of movement and exertion harmonizing between them as they focused on each exercise. Far away in the forest, two of the foxes were in the midst of a search for Hyangri Youngji. They moved cautiously among the trees, the damp earth soft beneath their feet, as one of them admitted his confusion about her exact whereabouts. The other fox suggested that if she were in danger, she would have already sent a flare, signaling for help. The first fox nodded, glancing around at the blossoming surroundings, remarking that the rain had encouraged all the columbine flowers to sprout beautifully, their colors vivid against the dark, wet forest floor. The second fox, however, allowed his thoughts to drift toward a more aggressive notion, commenting that it would be satisfying if they happened to encounter the prince weapon user and deal with him. The first fox let out a frustrated sigh, reflecting on how he had been unable to carry out even simple cardio training with Jester recently, and a sense of annoyance crept into his tone. After a lengthy and fruitless search, the two foxes reluctantly concluded that Hyangri Youngji might simply be enjoying herself somewhere. One of them rejected the idea outright, but then suggested they waste a moderate amount of time there before deciding to call it a day. The other fox agreed, casually noting that he would go and enjoy some snacks instead. Meanwhile, hidden high above in a tree, an imposter silently observed their conversation, her presence unnoticed as she absorbed every word, every hint of frustration and strategy. Back at the training site, after Haerang and Youngji finished their intense wrestling battle, Haerang commented on the change in the sky, noting that it had cleared and the world around them was now visible once more. He mentioned, almost teasingly, that it was time for him to depart, and he reminded her gently not to catch a cold. Youngji remained seated, her gaze lingering on him, and she thought to herself that Haerang was truly a gentleman to the very end. She also reflected on how considerate and thoughtful he had been during training, finding his demeanor surprisingly gentle and endearing despite his strength. Haerang, smiling lightly, walked away, his mood evidently lifted by the session, radiating a quiet happiness as he moved. Elsewhere, a member of the Fox team remained hidden beneath a tree, her arrow carefully aimed at Haerang. Frustration laced her thoughts as she muttered to herself that he was a fool with far too many openings, and she could not understand how Youngji had lost to him or how he had managed to claim the first blood that should have been hers. She steeled herself, thinking that she could not simply let him escape. Her plan was clear. First, she would make sure he could not use one of his legs, and then weaken him enough that he would neither want to leave nor have the strength to retaliate. Suspicion gnawed at her mind regarding his prince weapon, and she noted with admiration and slight irritation that the Pebbles team seemed to be performing at the peak of their abilities that day. Just as she was about to act, a sudden movement from behind startled her. A man appeared, pressing a hand over her mouth and instructing her to remain silent and follow him. As she turned her head slightly, recognition flickered across her features that it was Hok Surahang, a figure she knew well. Meanwhile, Haerang lifted his gaze to the sky, observing the brightness that lingered after the rain. The clarity of the night sharpened the atmosphere around him, making everything seem more vivid and alive. He reflected that he might not be able to find his way home tonight, but at least he could see clearly, navigating the path in the illuminated darkness. Still, a small disappointment lingered within him, wishing he could continue his workout session just a little longer. When Haerang reached the house, one of the boys immediately erupted with excitement, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he called out to everyone. He urged them to come down and see who had just arrived. He pointed toward Haerang and explained that this had to be the new guy who had become the talk of the town in recent days, emphasizing that he had appeared far quicker than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, another boy, standing slightly behind, studied Haerang's posture and movement carefully, remarking to himself that his arms and legs seemed well-proportioned and strong, capable of more than just ordinary tasks. One of the boys, clearly intrigued, turned to Haerang and asked whether he too possessed the prince's weapon, his words tinged with a teasing undertone. He added, almost playfully, that Haerang seemed perfect for the girls, like an easy target, a comment that underscored both admiration and envy. He continued with a hint of begrudging respect, noting that it was men like Haerang who caused repeated disruptions in the detachment force. He mentioned that, perhaps because of his abilities, Haerang had been specifically assigned to the Garimbi, a posting that carried its own weight and significance. At that moment, Suri entered the scene with a calm authority that instantly demanded attention. She addressed the boys directly, warning them not to approach Haerang recklessly. Her tone was firm, carrying the weight of experience, as she cautioned that anyone who attempted to provoke him without understanding his capabilities would likely face consequences similar to those their captain had endured. The boys, who had been buzzing with curiosity and bravado just moments before, froze in place. The shock of her words settled over them like a sudden chill. One of them, struggling to process the warning, muttered that it sounded as though Haerang had actually confronted Ryu Karim head-on, a thought that made the others exchange uneasy glances. Suri's explanation continued, her voice patient yet commanding. She stressed the need for caution and instructed Haerang to follow her closely, assuring him she would guide him through the nuances of their environment. She added that, soon enough, everyone would acclimate to one another, and there was no reason to worry excessively. As she spoke, she allowed herself a brief smile and complimented him on finding his way to the location, subtly acknowledging his skill and awareness. She reminded them all that their priority now was to report back to the elders. Turning to Hok Surahang, she praised his efforts, telling him he had done an exceptional job. Amid the interactions, one of the members, noticing Hok Surahang fully geared up, raised a question with an amused tone. He inquired into why Hok Surahang, who was expected to be on vacation, was instead fully prepared and ready for action. Laughter rippled through the group as they commented that from first glance it was clear he had just returned from protecting a significant figure, the mark of someone accustomed to high-stakes responsibility. Hok Surahang, however, paid no attention to their teasing or speculation. Instead, he quietly followed Haerang and Suri, moving at a steady, deliberate pace that suggested focus and discipline. The remaining members left behind in the courtyard stood in a mix of frustration and disbelief. They exchanged glances, muttering to each other, struggling to reconcile the notion that such a small, unassuming figure could have gone against someone like Ryu Karim. Some speculated that perhaps Haerang and Suri were deliberately withholding the full story, keeping the details of the confrontation hidden for reasons they could not yet understand. Meanwhile, Suri and Haerong entered the elder's room. Suri greeted the elder respectfully and informed him that Prince Haerong had returned safely. The elder, seated with an air of calm authority, asked whether Haerong had returned in one piece, his eyes searching for any sign of injury or fatigue. Suri reassured him that, for the moment, Haerong still had all his limbs intact and appeared unharmed. The elder's expression shifted to one of mild surprise and satisfaction, remarking that Haerong had returned far quicker than he had anticipated. He described the feat as magnificent, yet immediately noted that the young prince was likely exhausted from his journey and efforts. With a measured tone, he instructed Haerong to rest for the time being, assuring him that a detailed report would be heard the following day. With that, he concluded the meeting, allowing them to leave. Haerong responded respectfully to the elder, saying, "Yes, sir," his tone firm yet calm. Elder then added that the warning was fair, acknowledging that the coming days would be demanding. From tomorrow onward, the tasks would be grueling, relentless in their intensity for the foreseeable future. Both Haerong and Suri felt a brief mutual shock at the weight of the statement, a silent recognition of the hardships that awaited them. After a moment, they left the elder's room, their footsteps echoing softly through the corridor. As they walked, Haerong remarked thoughtfully that it seemed yet another order had come down from the royal palace, a subtle mixture of curiosity and concern in his voice. Suri, walking alongside him with her usual composed demeanor, responded that everyone was probably already aware that the orders had something to do with procuring those unusual exotic flowers once again. She added, in a practical tone, that he would most likely need to wash off the sweat and grime accumulated from the day's exertions. Haerong chuckled lightly and admitted he needed to do his laundry, the mundane task grounding him after the intensity of the morning's events. Suri, noticing his ease, reassured him that it was perfectly fine to speak informally with her here, allowing him to relax a little as she led him down the corridor toward one of the rooms. She gestured toward the modest but comfortable space, explaining that this would serve as his resting area. If he had questions or needed guidance, she told him he could always turn to his roommate, Ha Wung, who was already there. Suri praised Ha Wung lightly, calling him the best snail bride in the detachment force, a title that carried both respect and a touch of humor. Ha Wung, seated in the room, greeted Haerong warmly and suggested he go wash up, offering to heat the water. Haerong smiled in return, accepting the offer with a simple yes. Once Suri had finished her introductions and left, Ha Wung reminded Haerong that he should speak formally with him, a courtesy that Haerong acknowledged with a nod. Late that night, Ha Wung sat outside the house, chopping wood with careful, deliberate movements. He arranged the logs efficiently, ensuring the fire would burn steadily and that the water for Haerong would reach a perfect warmth. Inside, Haerong sank into the bath, the hot water enveloping him in a soothing embrace. He closed his eyes briefly, murmuring that it felt hot and comforting, the tension of the day slowly melting away. The quiet was broken when another member entered the bathing area, preparing for his own bath. Haerong, maintaining his politeness, introduced himself. The newcomer asked if he was the recruit from Garimbi, and casually told him not to worry about him, instructing Haerong to focus on his own routine. As he studied Haerong's face more closely, a flicker of recognition crossed his expression. He finally understood the reason Haerong was referred to as the prince weapon, the whispers and awe he had seen earlier making perfect sense in that moment. Meanwhile, Haerong remained focused on his bath, the warm water washing away both physical fatigue and lingering tension, yet his mind wandered persistently to Youngji. The next morning, the elder was holding a collar in his hand, turning it over slowly as if weighing its significance. He remarked with a mix of pride and surprise that Haerong had successfully received the Hyangri Youngji collar from the pebbles. Haerong stood quietly in front of the elder, his posture steady, but his mind alert to every word. Hokusarong was present as well, confirming the elder's statement, then inquired whether Haerong had remembered to give Youngji the protein shake. Haerong nodded and replied that he had. Hearing this, the elder said that Haerong had once again caused a significant commotion, yet he deserved congratulations for earning his first partner. Hyangri Youngji, he explained, was no ordinary companion, and the Pebbles was a raider captain whose reputation extended far and wide. Hokusarong added her own observations, her tone tinged with admiration. She noted that Youngji was formidable, capable of making even the bored flee in tears, and that her senses were sharp enough to detect wolves with ease. She was not someone to be underestimated, and even when cornered, she would never admit defeat. Often, it was those who challenged her who ended up feeling defeated instead. Recently, Youngji's determination had grown even stronger. A blazing fire ignited within her, making her presence even more formidable. The elder, clearly impressed, asked whether it was true that Haerong had given her the protein shake. Hoke Surong confirmed it without hesitation, and the elder allowed himself a small, approving smile. "This is quite admirable," the elder murmured, his eyes gleaming. He speculated that even the foxes must be going mad over Haerang, desperate to uncover his true identity. He anticipated that the upcoming field mission would be particularly engaging, and he assumed that Haerang had already sensed this. He explained that the mission would once again be a procurement mission, but hinted that if Haerang could locate something unusual or exceptional, his reward would be doubled. Everyone present listened intently, absorbing each word. Suri, ever practical, couldn't help but voice her doubt. She wondered how this approach made sense if their goal was simply to hit a quota. The elder, maintaining a firm but composed tone, reminded them that it was an imperial order. They were to complete their mission at all costs. He emphasized that the shadow ghost would forgive any future mistakes, but they needed to remain vigilant, and the fox side would strike back hard at any opportunity. He also instructed Captain Ryu Karim to take special care of the youngest member, a responsibility Karim accepted without hesitation, his voice steady and respectful. Afterwards, Hawung approached Haerang with a reassuring presence. He told him not to worry, assuring him that as long as he stayed by his side, everything would be fine. Haerang admitted quietly that he was not particularly nervous, though a subtle tension lingered in his chest. Hawung acknowledged this, noting that everyone experienced some anxiety the first time they faced such a situation. There was a quiet moment, almost a pause, where Haerong could feel the weight of expectations pressing on him, tempered by the calm reassurance of his comrades. The elder then called Karim aside, warning him not to attempt to control irrational numbers, citing the current instability of the imperial castle. Karim nodded thoughtfully, committing the words to memory. With instructions given, the group departed from the house to begin their mission. Suri, sensing Haerong's quiet contemplation, asked how he felt about embarking on his first official field mission. Haerong confessed that he had yet to feel the true weight of it, though a part of him was already absorbing every detail of the world around him. Suri teased him, suggesting that anyone who had felt it already must be crazy. Haerong reflected for a moment, recalling the nights he had ventured outside. Yet even those experiences paled in comparison to the breathtaking expanse beyond the border.